All right, hello everybody, welcome back. We are continuing in Module 4 now we're going to be talking about non-adaptive evolution and speciation. So before, we've been primarily focused on natural selection, and that is the driving force of evolution for the most part, but there are also other evolutionary forces at play. And as a group, we call those non-adaptive forms of evolution. So that's going to be our specific focus in today's lecture. So first I wanted to show you an interesting study by Dr. Herrera looking at damselflies and differences in wing coloration and form. So she's been studying these damselflies in Peru. And you can see that there are lots of differences between species. And what a big part of her study is understanding is what's driving these differences in color something due to natural selection? For example, like something that, some of these wings might confer some sort of survivorship benefit, like predators might try and ignore these bright red wings compared to something that's flat white like this. Or are there other factors, evolutionary factors, potentially at play that might be a little bit more random and less specific than natural selection? So that's what I'd like you to keep in mind as we're thinking through these next few slides. And these are the types of questions that evolutionary biologists are interested in. Why do we see these differences occurring in nature? So the primary mechanism of non-adaptive evolution that we're going to be talking about is a concept called genetic drift. And essentially what genetic drift is just a simple definition, it's the change in allele frequencies between generations that occurs purely by chance. And that's really the important part of this, that we're talking about the random parts of evolution now. Whereas before we were talking about adaptive evolution is non-random because it selects for a specific trait. Versus now we're talking about changes that happen purely by chance. And when we're talking about allele frequencies, all we're talking about there is the inheritable part of a gene that's passed down through generations, so that variant part of the gene. And again, we're going to go into more detail about what alleles are and how they encode for specific genes in later sections. But just for now, know that an allele is a variant that encodes for a specific trait in a species. So again, this genetic drift creates this subset of a population, a subset of allele frequencies that then reproduces. And then this subset of alleles is represented in the next generation. So that's just sort of like a textbook definition of what genetic drift looks like. And importantly, genetic drift is going to decrease the genetic diversity of a population. So the overall number of traits that exist in a population is going to decrease through genetic drift. So let's look at what that might actually look like. Again, we're talking about random changes in allele frequencies from one generation to the next. And this is particularly prevalent in small populations because genetic drift is going to influence small populations much greater than it would large populations. So here we have a picture of these frogs, and these red ones die out through death, and then through chance, these green ones become the prevalent allele that's passed down in the next generation. So we're seeing genetic drift happening, again, a random occurrence, creating this new population. So in your book, it has this excellent example looking at mice in New York City. And for every vertical bar here, that's showing the whole genome of an individual mouse. And the areas that are the same color are the areas of a genome that are similar to different mice. So what you can see here is that mice that are from the same neighborhood tend to have more genetic similarity to one another than mice in a different neighborhood. And so a question that, again, an evolutionary biologist can ask is, why do we see these changes in genetic in genetics across these different populations? Is there something that is selecting for specifically these traits, or is it something that is randomly occurring in these different areas? So those are the type of questions, again, that an evolutionary biologist might consider when thinking about what is causing the genetic evolution of these different mice populations. So let's think about a couple mechanisms of genetic drift. So the first instance of genetic drift that we're going to be talking about is something called the founder effect. So let's consider this population of mice. Let's call these the uptown mice. And they have specific allele frequencies before any sort of genetic drift happens. So you can see that each one of these genes, each one of these alleles, encodes for a single gene, right? So this one allele, two allele equals one gene. So you can see that there is an allele frequency of, there's only 6 of these blue alleles throughout the population, creating about 20%. Again, all of these have to equal 1. That is important later on for Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. But what happens if only a few of these, again, a random selection of these mice, migrate to a new area? Let's call this Midtown. So if all of these mice move and migrate to Midtown, they reproduce, we see that the allele frequencies differ because the mice that founded this new population are different than the mice that comprise this total population. So we start to see an increase of allele frequency in the green population, and we see that by chance is what's critical here, the blue allele is not represented in this new founding population. Another example of this that we talk about both in your book and also in a video I'll have you watch in the quiz is thinking about Darwin's finches. So you can think about a bird flying from the mainland and flying to a new island and starting to breed in that island. That is a founder effect. And so only the alleles that were represented in those original individuals that migrate are going to be found in the new population. Another important cause of genetic drift is something that we call the bottleneck effect. So the bottleneck effect is something that happens when we see a rapid loss of a large percentage of your original population. So for example, if we have our original very diverse diverse population, and let's say that these mice are living in a park, and then suddenly there is a urban development that goes in and fragments a large majority of the habitat that these mice were currently on. And again, by chance, only these mice were able to survive, these mice with this genetic makeup. And so they pass on those specific alleles to the new population. And again, you see differences in these allele frequencies before and after this large event that randomly selected these genes and alleles. And again, by chance, the red alleles were completely lost from the gene pool. So again, we have a random event that causes the loss of a specific allele, and we have now a new, less diverse bottleneck population. So we've gone from something that is more diverse to something that is less diverse. And I'd like you to sort of think to yourself, what would happen if the event were were occurring in a much more diverse population? Would you be more likely to potentially have a slightly more diverse bottleneck population? So think through some of those scenarios, because that will be sort of important in terms of understanding genetic diversity in later lectures. So why is genetic diversity important? Diverse gene pool provides a population more flexibility to survive in a changing environment. And the more genetically diverse a population is, the more ways and more potential it has to be able to adapt and survive in its environment. So it's critical sometimes to introduce genetic diversity into populations. So you want to be continually bringing in these new alleles, potentially through mutation or through a process called gene flow, which is the movement of alleles from one population to another. And again, we're going to look back at our example of these mice. And this is just showing random gene flow between two populations. So you can see that some population from these blue and green alleles, again, we don't have very diverse population. And as migration and interbreeding happens between these populations, we start to get gene flow and a more diverse population. So gene flow is in this case, increasing the amount of genetic variation within our populations. So just to give you a good overview of what we've talked about so far, looking at natural selection, mutation, genetic drift, and gene flow. And critically, whether or not, what we consider these in terms of evolutionary biology. So is it adaptive or is it non-adaptive? Is it random or is it non-random? So adaptive evolution is always non-random, natural selection, and then looking at how the allele frequencies are expected to change under each of these. So this is a really important summation of what we've sort of gone over. And I'd spend some time with this specific chart because it's going to be really important both for your exam and also just understanding changes that are happening genetically within populations. All right, thanks so much. I will see you in the next section.